Inside the glass tower of Harrison and Wells, Brian stood in a conference room where every eye held contempt. Worn blazer, scuffed shoes, single dad with no degree. "You're wasting our time," someone said. His hand touched the door handle to leave. Then the notification hit every screen. Project Horizon collapsed. $20 million gone. A data error their entire team couldn't solve in 3 months. Brian glanced at the projection screen through the open door. His brain caught something in 5 seconds. "I know where the error is," he said quietly. "Can this invisible man turn around his destiny? And the company's?" 3 months earlier, Brian had been stacking boxes in a warehouse at 2 in the morning when he saw the job posting on his phone. Data engineer position, Harrison and Wells, one of the top consulting firms in the city. He'd stared at the screen for a long time before hitting apply. The morning of the interview, he borrowed $60 from his neighbor Marcus to buy the blazer from the thrift store on 7th Street. It smelled like mothballs, and the elbows were thin, but it was the best he could afford. He spent 20 minutes polishing his only pair of dress shoes until they looked almost acceptable. The heel was worn down on the right side from years of walking, but he told himself nobody would notice. His daughter Emma sat at the kitchen table eating cereal. She was 5 years old and didn't ask why Daddy was wearing fancy clothes. She'd learned not to ask too many questions about money or jobs, or why they lived in a 1-bedroom apartment where she slept on the couch. "Be good for Mrs. Chen today," Brian said, then caught himself. "Mrs. Patterson." The neighbor who watched Emma when he worked late shifts. Emma nodded with milk on her upper lip. Brian kissed the top of her head and left before she could see his hands shaking. The Harrison and Wells building was all glass and steel, 40 stories of people who belonged there. The receptionist looked him up and down when he gave his name. Her eyes lingered on his blazer, on his shoes, on the way he stood like someone who wasn't used to standing in lobbies like this. "4th floor," she said without smiling. The elevator had mirrors. Brian avoided looking at himself. The conference room was cold. 4 people sat behind a long table with bottles of imported water and leather portfolios. Brian recognized the setup from online research, the interview panel, the people who would decide if he was worth their time. David sat in the middle. Head of data, Harvard degree on his LinkedIn, tailored suit. Watch that cost more than Brian made in 6 months. He glanced at Brian's resume and set it down like it was contaminated. "So," David said. "Brian, tell us about your educational background." Brian's throat went dry. "I attended State University for 3 years. I didn't complete my degree." Sarah, the senior engineer, raised an eyebrow. She had a Yale MBA and the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in rooms like this. "You didn't finish college?" "No, ma'am. My wife got sick. I had to drop out to take care of her." "And now?" Tom from HR asked. His smile was thin and professional and completely empty. "She passed away 3 years ago." "I'm sorry to hear that," Tom said, in a tone that meant he wasn't sorry at all. "But you understand we only hire candidates with at least a bachelor's degree. It's company policy." Brian nodded. He'd known this was coming. "I understand. But I've been teaching myself data engineering for 5 years. Every night after work, I've built projects, learned Python and SQL, studied machine learning algorithms. I passed your online assessment test." David leaned back in his chair. "A lot of people pass that test. It's basic screening. What we need here are people with real credentials, people who've been trained by the best institutions." "I've built a portfolio," Brian said. He pulled out his laptop, old and heavy with a cracked screen. "I can show you what I've worked on." Sarah barely glanced at it. "This looks like something a student would make." "I am a student. I'm just not in a classroom." "Tell me about gradient descent," David said suddenly. Brian explained it. The math, the concept, how it optimizes machine learning models by minimizing error through iterative steps. He'd studied this for months, tested it on datasets he'd found online, debugged it until he understood every variable. David nodded slowly. That's textbook knowledge. Anyone can read that in a book. What about practical application? Real-world scenarios with messy data and impossible deadlines. I work 3 jobs to support my daughter, Brian said quietly. I understand messy situations and impossible deadlines. Tom wrote something in his notes. Why do you think you deserve to be here? This is one of the most competitive firms in the industry. We have candidates from MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon. What makes you think you can compete with that? Brian looked at the table, at the water bottles he couldn't afford, at the leather portfolios and the degrees framed in their LinkedIn profiles, and the certainty in their eyes that he didn't belong. Because I need this job to support my daughter. The room went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet, the kind that meant they'd already made their decision. David stood up. Look, we appreciate you coming in, but I think it's clear this isn't the right fit. We need people with credentials, with proven track records from reputable institutions. You understand? Brian understood. He'd understood before he walked in. But he'd hoped anyway, the way desperate people always hope. Thank you for your time, he said. He gathered his laptop and stood up. His chair scraped against the floor. Nobody shook his hand. Victoria Hayes, the CEO, sat at the end of the table. She'd been silent the entire interview, just watching with dark eyes that gave nothing away. She didn't stop him from leaving. Brian walked to the door. His reflection caught in the glass. A man who didn't belong in buildings like this. His hand touched the door handle. Then the sound hit. Loud. Urgent. Coming from the conference room next door. The door burst open, and 3 senior executives rushed out, faces drained of color. One of them was shouting into a phone. They can't just cancel. We've been working on this for 3 months. Another executive, a woman in a sharp gray suit, was nearly running toward David's interview room. We need everyone in the main conference room now. Horizon just collapsed. David's expression changed instantly. What do you mean collapsed? The client pulled out. $20 million contract. They said our data model is fundamentally flawed. They're taking their business to Stratton Analytics. Sarah stood up so fast her chair fell backward. That's impossible. We've triple-checked everything. Well, apparently we missed something critical, the woman in gray said. Her voice was ice. Because they just sent us a 10-page report explaining why our retention rate projections are worthless. The board is losing their minds. We need damage control now. People were flooding into the hallway. Phones were ringing. Someone was swearing. The calm, sterile environment of Harrison and Wells had fractured into chaos in under 30 seconds. Brian stood there with his hand still on the door handle. Through the open door of the main conference room, he could see a massive projection screen, charts and graphs and data visualizations, a presentation about customer retention analysis, the same kind of work he'd studied alone in his apartment while Emma slept on the couch. His brain started working before he could stop it. Pattern recognition, data flow, variable relationships, the things he'd trained himself to see in the dark hours between midnight and dawn. He looked at the retention rate chart on the screen. 91%. A beautiful number. The kind of number that would make a client sign a $20 million contract. But something was wrong. The data points were too clean, too consistent. No real-world dataset looked like that without heavy filtering. And the baseline variables they were using for active users included login frequency, but login frequency didn't necessarily mean engagement. Someone could log in every day because of automated email reminders and never actually use the product. And there was something else. The duplicate user detection. He could see from the methodology slide that they were using email-based deduplication. But that wouldn't catch users who registered multiple accounts with different emails on the same device. Device fingerprinting was the standard approach for that, but it didn't look like they'd implemented it. If they hadn't filtered duplicate accounts properly, their retention rate would be artificially inflated, maybe by a lot. That was the error. Brian's hands went cold. He could see it, clear as daylight. The flaw that had caused a $20 million contract to evaporate. The thing their Harvard and MIT and Stanford graduates had somehow missed in 3 months of work. He could walk away right now, go back to his warehouse job and his delivery shifts and his late nights teaching himself things nobody would ever give him credit for. He could go home to Emma and tell her daddy didn't get the job. But that was okay. They'd figure something out like they always did. Or he could turn around. If he was wrong, they'd humiliate him even worse than they already had. They'd laugh him out of the building. He'd become a story they told at company happy hours about the guy with no degree who thought he could solve their problems. If he was right, everything could change. Brian thought about Emma, about the way she never complained when dinner was pasta again. About how she'd asked him last week if they could go to the zoo, and he'd said maybe next month, knowing next month wouldn't be any different. He thought about 3 more years of warehouse shifts and aching joints and falling asleep in front of tutorial videos at 3 in the morning. He turned around. The conference room was packed now. David and Sarah and Tom and a dozen other people crowding around the projection screen. Victoria Hayes stood near the front, arms crossed, face unreadable. Brian knocked on the doorframe. Nobody heard him. He knocked louder. David turned. His face was still red from stress and anger. "What? We're in the middle of a crisis here." "I know," Brian said. His voice was steady, even though his heart was trying to break through his ribs. "And I think I know where the error is." The conference room went dead silent. 20 people turned to stare at Brian like he'd just announced he could fly. David's face shifted from red to purple. "What did you just say?" "I think I know where the error is," Brian repeated. His voice was steadier than his hands. "In your data model." Sarah let out a sharp laugh. "You've got to be kidding me. We have a team of PhDs who've been working on this for 3 months. You looked at a screen for 5 seconds and think you found something we missed? Who do you even think you are?" David took a step toward him. "We just rejected you. You don't work here. You don't belong here. And now you're interrupting a crisis to play data analyst." Brian's jaw tightened. "I saw the retention rate chart on your projection, 91%. But the data looks too clean. I think there's bias in your input." "Bias?" Sarah's voice dripped with contempt. "We filtered everything according to industry standards, multiple rounds of validation, peer review. Where exactly did you get your data science degree that makes you qualified to question our methodology?" "I don't have one," Brian said quietly. "But I've been studying this for 5 years, every night. And I think you're calculating retention based on active users without properly filtering duplicate accounts and bot registrations." David moved closer. His cologne was expensive and overwhelming. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Do you have any idea how thoroughly we clean our data? We use email-based deduplication. Standard protocol. Email-based deduplication doesn't catch users who register multiple accounts with different emails on the same device," Brian said. "You need device fingerprinting for that. And if you're counting login frequency as engagement without measuring actual product usage, your active user definition is going to inflate your retention numbers." The room went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. Victoria Hayes moved from her position at the back. She'd been silent during the entire interview and through all the chaos. Now she walked slowly toward the front of the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Everyone stepped aside for her. She looked at Brian for a long moment. Her face gave away nothing. You're saying our $20 million project failed because we didn't filter duplicate accounts properly? I'm saying it's a possibility worth checking. And you determined this from looking at a screen for 5 seconds? Brian met her eyes. I determined it from 5 years of teaching myself how to read data while working 3 jobs to support my daughter. Something flickered across Victoria's face, too fast to name. She turned slightly, glancing at David and Sarah with an expression that was almost amused, then back to Brian. Her lips curved, but it wasn't quite a smile. Something colder, more calculated. Okay, she said. The word landed like a challenge. I'll give you 10 minutes. Prove it. She crossed her arms and stepped back deliberately. The posture of someone watching a performance they already knew would end badly. A teacher giving a student just enough rope. Tom shifted uncomfortably. Sarah's smirk returned. Victoria wasn't giving Brian a chance. She was giving him a stage to fail on. 10 minutes for him to realize he was out of his depth. 10 minutes to embarrass himself so thoroughly he'd leave on his own and never come back. A lesson in knowing your place. The room erupted. Victoria, you can't be serious, Tom said. He's not even an employee. This is highly irregular. He doesn't have credentials, Sarah added. He could be completely wrong and waste valuable time we don't have. David looked like he wanted to physically remove Brian from the building. This is insane. We're in the middle of a crisis, and you want to let some random guy with no degree lecture us about data science? Victoria's voice cut through the noise like ice. I'm the CEO. David, give him the whiteboard. Nobody moved. Now. David's face went rigid. He stepped aside. Sarah crossed her arms and leaned against the wall with an expression that said she was watching a car crash in slow motion. Tom pulled out his phone and started typing notes, probably documenting this for HR purposes. Brian walked to the whiteboard. His legs felt like water. 20 pairs of eyes burned into his back. The marker was cold and heavy in his hand. 10 minutes. 600 seconds to prove he wasn't delusional. To prove 5 years of late nights and tutorial videos and practice datasets meant something. To prove he belonged in this room. He wrote the first formula. His hand shook, and the numbers came out wrong. He erased it, started again. The pressure crushed down on him like a physical weight. Behind him, someone coughed. It sounded like a laugh. Brian wrote the equation for calculating retention rate. Basic stuff. But his mind was moving too fast, and his hand too slow, and the marker kept squeaking against the board in a way that made his teeth hurt. This is painful to watch, Sarah muttered. Not quietly enough. David checked his watch. 5 minutes gone. Brian's vision started to blur. The numbers on the board swam together. He'd studied this. He knew this. But standing here under these lights with these people watching him fail was different from sitting alone in his apartment, with Emma asleep on the couch. He thought about going back to that apartment tonight. About telling Emma that Daddy didn't get the job. About another year of warehouse shifts and delivery routes, and checking the prices at the grocery store before putting anything in the cart. About being invisible. His hand stopped moving. Then he thought about the look on Emma's face last week when he'd promised they'd go to the zoo next month. The way she'd smiled even though they both knew next month wouldn't be different. The way she believed in him even when nobody else did. Brian erased the entire board. 4 minutes, David said. Brian started drawing. Not formulas this time. A diagram. The flow of data from input to output. He marked where Harrison and Wells was pulling their user information. How they defined an active user. What variables they were tracking. Then he circled the gaps. No device fingerprinting. Just email deduplication. Which meant users registering multiple accounts with different emails would be counted as separate unique users, inflating the total user base. login frequency as the primary engagement metric, which meant users who logged in because of automated email reminders but never actually used the product would be classified as active. Inflating the retention rate. No segmentation between high-value and low-value users, which meant they couldn't see that their most valuable customers were leaving at higher rates than their overall numbers suggested. He drew arrows showing how each gap compounded the others, how a 31% duplicate rate combined with false engagement signals could make a 68% retention rate look like 91%. "Time," David announced. Brian put down the marker. His shirt was soaked through with sweat. He turned to face the room. "I didn't have time to recalculate everything," he said. His voice came out rough. "But if you check your raw data using device fingerprinting instead of just email deduplication, and if you measure actual product engagement instead of just login frequency, I think you'll find your retention rate is significantly lower than 91%, probably somewhere in the high 60s. Nobody spoke. David stared at the whiteboard. His face had gone from purple to a sick gray color. Sarah pulled out her laptop. Her fingers moved fast across the keyboard. She wasn't smiling anymore. Victoria walked up to the board. She studied the diagram Brian had drawn, traced the arrows with her eyes, read each annotation. The calculated amusement had vanished from her expression. Then she turned to David. "Check it now." David's jaw clenched. "Victoria, this is based on a theory from someone with zero professional experience. We've already validated our methodology. This is a waste of time." "Check it now," Victoria repeated. Her voice was soft, deadly soft. David pulled out his laptop with sharp, angry movements. He opened their database. His fingers hammered the keys as he wrote a query to pull the raw data and apply device fingerprinting to identify duplicates. The room watched in silence as he ran the script. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. David's face got progressively paler. "Oh God," he whispered. Sarah looked over his shoulder. Her expression cracked. David's voice came out hollow. "Duplicate rate is 31%. If we remove duplicate accounts and recalculate based on device fingerprint, actual retention rate is 68%, not 91. The number hung in the air like smoke. Someone swore. Someone else dropped their phone. Tom stopped typing and just stared at David's screen. "That's impossible," Sarah said. But her voice had lost its edge. "We've been working on this for 3 months. We had multiple people review the data cleaning process. And we all made the same assumption," David said quietly. "That email deduplication was sufficient. We never thought to check device-level data." Victoria turned to Brian. Her expression hadn't changed, but something in her eyes was different now. Sharper. More focused. The cold calculation had transformed into something like respect. "You just identified the root cause of a $20 million failure in 10 minutes, she said. "The same problem my entire team missed for 3 months. Brian didn't know what to say. His heart was still trying to break through his ribs. Victoria continued. "But identifying a problem is different from solving it. You've shown me you can see what others miss. Now you need to show me you can build a solution that actually works." She let that sink in. Then she said the words that would change everything. "I'm giving you 3 days. Build a new model. Prove it works. If you succeed, you stay. If you fail, I personally walk you to the door." The room exploded. "Victoria, you can't be serious," Tom said. "He doesn't even have a degree. Company policy explicitly requires a minimum of a bachelor's degree for any data position. HR will have a field day with this." "I'm the CEO," Victoria said without looking at him. "I make the policy." Sarah stepped forward. 3 days to rebuild an entire data pipeline. That's not just difficult, it's functionally impossible. We have systems, dependencies, security protocols. He doesn't even have proper access credentials. "Then get him credentials," Victoria said. David's voice was tight. "This is insane. We're in crisis mode, And you want to gamble on someone with no professional experience and no degree? What happens when he fails? Because he will fail. This isn't a classroom exercise. This is real work with real consequences. Victoria finally looked at David. Then you'll have 3 days to prepare a backup plan, but I'm giving him the chance. David, assign him a workspace. Sarah, make sure he has access to the necessary tools and databases. Tom, handle the paperwork for a 3-day contractor agreement. She turned back to Brian. 72 hours, starting now. Show me what you can do. Then she walked out of the conference room. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a judge's gavel. Brian stood there, holding a whiteboard marker and trying to understand what had just happened. David moved close. His voice was low and cold. Let me be very clear. You got lucky. You spotted something obvious that we overlooked because we were working at scale. But building a functioning data pipeline in 3 days? You're going to crash and burn. And when you do, I'll make sure everyone knows that this was Victoria's mistake, not ours. He walked past Brian and out the door. Sarah followed without a word. Tom gathered his things and left with a tight smile that was more grimace than anything friendly. The room emptied. Brian was left alone with a whiteboard full of diagrams and the weight of 72 hours pressing down on his shoulders. He pulled out his phone. 2 missed calls from Mrs. Patterson. A text from Emma. "When are you coming home, Daddy?" He texted back. "Soon, sweetheart. Daddy loves you." Then he put the phone away and got to work. Day 1 was hell. They gave him a desk in the corner of the open workspace. No office, no privacy. Just a small table wedged between the printer and the emergency exit. David dropped a hard drive on his desk with over 2 million rows of raw data and told him to figure it out himself. "You have 72 hours, David said. "Don't ask us for help." "This is your test." Sarah walked by twice without acknowledging him. Other employees stared openly, whispered to each other. Brian caught fragments of conversation. "Who's that guy? Victoria's charity case. I heard he doesn't even have a degree. This is what happens when diversity initiatives go too far." Brian put in earbuds and started working. He spent 6 hours just getting access to the necessary systems. The documentation was scattered across multiple internal wikis. The database credentials took 3 different approval requests. The Python libraries he needed weren't installed on his machine, and IT took 2 hours to respond to his ticket. By midnight, he'd written basic scripts to clean the data. By 3 in the morning, he'd identified the duplicate accounts and removed them from the sample data set. By dawn, he'd built a skeleton framework for the new model. He slept 2 hours at his desk, woke up with a stiff neck and the cleaning crew vacuuming around him. Day 2 was worse. Every system he touched seemed designed to fight him. Database queries timed out. Code that worked on his laptop failed on the company servers. File permissions blocked his access to critical data sets. David walked by at lunch and saw Brian staring at an error message. "Having trouble?" David asked. His smile was thin. "Access denied on the transaction logs," Brian said. "I need them to validate the model outputs. Those require level 3 clearance. You're level 1, temporary contractor. You'll need to submit a request through the security team." "How long does that take?" "Usually 5 to 7 business days." Brian's stomach dropped. "I have until tomorrow morning." David shrugged. "Should have thought of that before you made promises you couldn't keep." He walked away. Brian stared at his screen. Without transaction logs, he couldn't verify that his model was accurately predicting user behavior. He could build the pipeline, but he couldn't prove it worked. 36 hours left. His daughter was staying with Mrs. Patterson again. He'd promised Emma he'd be home for dinner. He'd lied. By evening, he'd found a workaround, an older backup of the transaction logs that didn't require level 3 clearance. The data was 3 months out of date, but it was better than nothing. He ran validation tests until his eyes burned. The model worked on historical data, predicted user churn with 83% accuracy, better than the old model's 76%. But there was a problem. A critical variable was missing. Customer lifetime value data from the legacy CRM system. Without it, the model couldn't distinguish between high-value customers who were about to churn and low-value customers who didn't matter as much to retention strategy. It was a small thing, but it was the difference between a good model and a great one. The difference between Victoria believing in him and showing him the door. Brian submitted an access request for the legacy CRM, got an automated response. Request received. Estimated processing time, 5 to 7 business days. He put his head in his hands. Day 3, 18 hours left. Brian hadn't slept. His eyes felt like sandpaper. He'd built 80% of the new pipeline, tested it on sample data, fixed bugs, optimized queries. But without the customer lifetime value data, the model was incomplete. He'd tried everything. Called IT, emailed the database administrator, left voicemails. Nobody responded on a Sunday night. At 11 at night, he accepted that he was going to fail. He'd come close, closer than he had any right to expect. But close wasn't enough. He was packing up his laptop when the conference room door opened. Victoria Hayes walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one on his desk. "You need the CLV data," she said. It wasn't a question. Brian looked up. "Yes, but access takes 5 days minimum. I'm out of time." Victoria pulled out her phone, typed something. A minute later, Brian's email pinged. Access granted. Legacy CRM system. All permissions. "You have 4 hours, Victoria said. "If you can't finish by then, I'm walking you out myself at 3 in the morning." Brian stared at the access notification. "Why are you doing this?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. 15 years ago, I was standing where you're standing. Different building. Same doubt. I had an MBA from a school nobody respected. I'd been rejected by 47 companies. When someone finally gave me a chance, everyone called it a diversity hire. Said I was there to check a box. She looked at him directly. I built a model that grew that company by 300% in 2 years. Proved that potential matters more than pedigree. I've never forgotten what it feels like to be underestimated. She turned to leave, then stopped at the door. 4 hours, Brian. Show me I'm right about you. Brian worked like his life depended on it, because it did. He pulled the CLV data, integrated it into the model, ran test after test, fixed errors, optimized, validated. At 2:45 in the morning, the final test completed. The model worked. Retention prediction accuracy, 87%. Customer churn identification, 30 days in advance with 84% precision. It wasn't just good. It was better than anything Harrison and Wells had ever built. Brian saved everything, backed it up 3 times. Then he put his head down on the desk and closed his eyes for 15 minutes. When he looked up, Victoria was standing in the doorway. "It's done," Brian said. "The model's ready." Victoria nodded once. "Tomorrow morning, 8 in the morning. You present to the executive board and our former client. If they're impressed, you stay. If not..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Brian went home at 4 in the morning, not to sleep, just to shower and change into a clean shirt. Emma was asleep on the couch with Mrs. Patterson dozing in the armchair, infomercials playing on mute. He kissed Emma's forehead without waking her, left a note on the counter. "Daddy has something important today. I love you." By 6 in the morning, he was back at Harrison and Wells, sitting in the empty conference room with his laptop and a presentation he'd thrown together in 30 minutes. The slides were simple, basic, nothing like the polished decks the company usually produced. But the model was sound. The data was clean. The results were real. That had to be enough. At 7:30 in the morning, people started arriving. Board members in expensive suits, senior executives Brian had never seen before. The former client, a silver-haired man named Richard Clemson, who ran a major retail analytics firm. He looked at Brian the way you'd look at a stain on expensive furniture. David and Sarah came in together. They didn't acknowledge Brian, just took seats near the back and waited with the grim expressions of people watching an execution. Tom from HR sat near the door with his laptop open, taking notes. Victoria was the last to enter. She'd changed into a different suit, dark navy. No jewelry except a simple watch. She sat at the head of the table and gestured for everyone to settle. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Victoria said. Her voice carried the kind of authority that made everyone sit a little straighter. "As you know, we lost the Horizon contract 3 days ago due to fundamental errors in our data modeling. This meeting is about the solution." Richard Clemson leaned back in his chair. "With all due respect, Victoria, we've already signed with Stratton Analytics. Unless you have something revolutionary to show us, I'm not sure why I'm here." "We do," Victoria said. She looked at Brian. "This is Brian Miller. He identified the root cause of our data failure. He's also built a new model in 72 hours. I'd like him to present his findings." Richard's eyebrows went up. 72 hours? Your team spent 3 months and couldn't deliver. Now you're telling me someone fixed it in 3 days. "Yes," Victoria said simply. "Brian, the floor is yours." Brian stood. His legs felt hollow. Every eye in the room was on him, judging, measuring, waiting for him to fail. He connected his laptop to the projection screen. The first slide appeared. No fancy graphics, just a title: "Why We Got It Wrong." 3 months ago, Brian started. This company told a client their retention rate was 91%. That number was based on careful analysis by experienced data scientists using industry-standard methodologies. It was also completely wrong. He clicked to the next slide, a simple diagram showing data flow. The error wasn't in the model itself, it was in the input. We were measuring active users based on login frequency. But logging in doesn't mean engagement. Someone can log in every day because of automated email reminders and never actually use your product. They're counted as retained users when they're actually already gone. Richard frowned. Our tech team raised that concern. Your people told us it was accounted for. It wasn't, Brian said. And there was a second issue. The deduplication process used email matching. But users who create multiple accounts with different emails on the same device were counted as separate individuals. That inflated the user base by 31%. David shifted in his seat. Sarah was staring at the table. Brian clicked to the next slide. Here's what happens when you combine those two errors. You get retention numbers that look amazing. 91%. Any executive would sign off on that. But the real number was 68%. That 23-point gap is the difference between success and failure. The room was silent. Richard's expression had changed from skeptical to interested. "So what's your solution?" Richard asked. Brian advanced to the next slide. This one showed the new model architecture. Device fingerprinting instead of email deduplication. Engagement scoring based on actual product usage, not just logins. Customer lifetime value integration, so we can identify high-value users at risk of churning. And predictive analytics that can flag potential churn 30 days in advance with 84% precision. He let that sink in, then continued. The old model told you who had already left. This model tells you who's about to leave, while there's still time to do something about it. And it focuses your retention efforts on the users who actually matter to your bottom line. Richard leaned forward. What kind of accuracy are we talking about? 87% for retention prediction, 84% precision on churn identification. Tested on 3 months of historical data with validation across multiple user segments. One of the board members spoke up. How do we know this isn't just retrofitted to historical data? That it'll actually work going forward? You don't, Brian admitted. Not until you test it in production. But I can show you the validation methodology, the cross-testing across different time periods, the edge cases I accounted for, and I can walk you through exactly how the model handles new users versus established users versus declining users. He spent the next 20 minutes doing exactly that, breaking down the technical details, answering questions, showing the data that supported every claim. The board members asked pointed questions. Brian answered them. When he didn't know something, he said so. When he made an assumption, he labeled it clearly. This wasn't a sales pitch. It was a technical presentation by someone who understood the work at a fundamental level, who'd built it with his own hands, who'd tested it until he was certain it was right. Richard asked for a copy of the model documentation. Brian sent it to him on the spot. "Give me 10 minutes to review this with my team," Richard said. He stood and walked out with 2 of his people. The conference room door closed behind them. The room erupted into quiet conversation. Board members huddled together. David and Sarah were having an intense, whispered discussion. Brian sat down. His hands were shaking. He'd done everything he could. Either it was enough, or it wasn't. Victoria caught his eye from across the room. She nodded once. Not approval, just acknowledgement. 10 minutes felt like 10 hours. When Richard came back, his expression was unreadable. He sat down and looked directly at Brian. "I've reviewed your methodology. My team has questions about scalability and real-time processing, but the core approach is sound. Better than sound. It's what we should have had 3 months ago." He turned to Victoria. "If you're willing to implement this model and provide ongoing support, we'll reinstate the Horizon contract. Same terms. $20 million over 2 years." The room erupted. Board members started talking over each other. Someone started clapping. Victoria remained calm, but Brian saw the relief flash across her face for just a second. Richard stood. "But I want him on the project team." He pointed at Brian. "Not as a consultant, as the lead data engineer. This is his model. He should be the one to implement it." David's face went white. Sarah looked like she'd been slapped. Victoria stood and extended her hand to Richard. "Done." They shook. The meeting dissolved into conversations about implementation timelines and contract details. Brian sat there trying to process what had just happened. He'd gotten the contract back. He'd saved the company $20 million. He'd gone from rejected candidate to lead engineer in 72 hours. Didn't feel real. Victoria found him after the room had mostly cleared. David and Sarah had left without a word. The board members were gone. It was just the 2 of them and the morning sun coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You did it," Victoria said. "I got lucky," Brian said. "If you hadn't given me that last access, I wouldn't have finished." "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. You prepared for 5 years. I just gave you the opportunity." She handed him a folder. "Employment contract. Lead data engineer. Salary is $120,000 annually plus benefits. You start Monday." Brian took the folder with numb hands. $120,000. More money than he'd made in the last 3 years combined. "There's something you should understand," Victoria continued. "This isn't going to be easy. David is going to resent you. Sarah's going to question every decision you make. Some people will always see you as the guy who got hired without credentials. You're going to have to prove yourself every single day." "I know," Brian said, "but I believe you can do it, because you've already proven something more important than credentials. You've proven you can see what others miss. You can work harder than anyone else. And you don't give up when things get impossible. Victoria moved toward the door, then stopped. 15 years ago, someone told me I didn't belong in a company like theirs, that I was a diversity hire, that I'd never be more than a token. She looked back at him. I'm now the CEO of that company. It took a decade of proving myself over and over, but I got here, and you will too. She left. Brian stood alone in the conference room with a contract in his hands and sunlight warming his face. He pulled out his phone. It was almost 10 in the morning. Emma would be awake by now. He called Mrs. Patterson. Is Emma there? She's eating breakfast. You want to talk to her? Yes, please. A rustling sound. Then Emma's small voice. Daddy? Hey, sweetheart. How would you like to go to the zoo today? Really? The excitement in her voice made his throat tight. Really? Daddy finished his important work. We can go see the lions and the elephants and get ice cream. Can we get 2 scoops? Brian smiled. For the first time in 3 days, he smiled without effort. We can get 3 scoops if you want. Emma squealed with delight. Brian could hear Mrs. Patterson laughing in the background. I'll pick you up in an hour, okay? I love you, Emma. I love you too, Daddy. He ended the call and stood there for a moment, looking out at the city, at the buildings full of people who belonged, at the life he'd just fought his way into. That evening, Brian sat on a bench outside the zoo while Emma slept against his shoulder. She'd worn herself out chasing peacocks and trying to name every animal they saw. 2 ice cream cones had left sticky residue on her shirt. She was smiling in her sleep. The sun was setting behind the Harrison and Wells building in the distance. 40 stories of glass and steel, where, 4 days ago, he'd been told he didn't belong. He thought about borrowing money for interview clothes, about the room where they'd dismissed him, about 3 days of impossible work and Victoria's final test at 2:45 in the morning, about Richard Clemson saying, I want him on the project team. Brian adjusted Emma's weight on his shoulder. She mumbled something in her sleep about elephants. From a single dad, humiliated in an interview, to the lead engineer on a $20 million project. From invisible to essential. From rejected to respected. He'd rewritten his own story and proved that potential doesn't come from pedigree. It comes from the willingness to keep fighting when everyone tells you to give up. Sometimes the people who give you a chance aren't the ones who believe in you from the start. They're the ones who are brave enough to let you prove them wrong. And sometimes that's all you need. One chance.